Welcome, everybody. I'm Mark Mather. I'm Associate Vice President with the Population Reference Bureau. I want to thank everybody for joining us for this webinar today. The topic is the effect of educational attainment on adult mortality in the United States. I have just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. First, if you have any questions that you'd like to submit to the presenters, you can type those into the question box, which you should see on the right hand of your screen in the webinar control panel. We are going to hold questions to the end, so panelists will, I'll feed those questions to the panelists at the end of the presentation today. I also want to note that there's going to be a very short survey at the end of the presentation, so we do encourage people to fill that out. It will help us plan for future topics for other webinars. And finally, this webinar will be recorded, so if you have to leave early, you'll be able to access it online later. We're going to send a follow-up email to all of the participants and the people who weren't able to participate with a link to the recording so that they'll be able to access it at your convenience. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Linda Jacobson. Linda's Vice President of Domestic Programs at PRB, who's going to introduce today's speakers. Linda?
Thanks, Mark. I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar, which is sponsored by PRB's Center for Public Information on Population Research with funding from the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. This webinar is based on a new population bulletin that was just released yesterday. And as you can see here, it's available on PRB's homepage, and it can be downloaded for free. Now, I'd like to introduce the co-authors of this bulletin and today's presenters. We will hear first from Dr. Robert Hummer, who is Centennial Commission Professor of Liberal Arts in the Department of Sociology and the Population Research Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Our second speaker is Dr. Elaine Hernandez, a postdoctoral fellow at the Population Research Center at the University of Texas at Austin. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Hummer.
Okay, thank you all to all the attendees for logging on, and particularly so in the midst of a beautiful summer day. Your interest and participation is very much appreciated. Thank you as well to Lynn and Mark. It's been a great pleasure to work with you and to everyone at PRB on this webinar and related population bulletin over the last few months. We also want to acknowledge appreciation to the many colleagues who have worked with us on educational mortality research over the last 8 years. A group that originated at UT Austin and the University of Colorado at Boulder and has since spread to many universities throughout the country. Thank you all. What we will do over the next 40 or so minutes is the following. I'll first describe the latest research that describes educational differences in adult mortality. We'll describe recent research that documents changes in these differences. And then I'll discuss research that examines the reasons why there are such large current differentials in mortality by educational attainment. Elaine will then discuss the policy implications of this body of research. We'll close with a 10 to 15-minute question and answer session with audience members. I start with a graph depicting U.S. trends in life expectancy at birth over the last 50 years. There are 3 points to emphasize here. First, U.S. life expectancy figures, which are derived from mortality rates, have inched up quite steadily over the last half century, somewhat more rapid for men than for women. Second, while these are very important gains, U.S. life expectancy figures are well short of many other countries. The U.S. is ranked somewhere around 25th in the world in life expectancy, so that alone says that the U.S. has much room for improvement. Third, one reason why the U.S. lags behind is that we have very large disparities in mortality rates across subgroups of the population, with one of those factors being educational attainment. So why focus on educational attainment, mortality, and life expectancy? First, there are large, impressive, and growing literatures on both education and health and education and mortality. Scholars across many disciplines in demography, sociology, economics, public health, epidemiology, and medicine have increasingly recognized the potential powerful influences of education as a determinant of both health and longevity. In fact, leading scholars have even termed education a fundamental cause of health and disease. Education is a powerful, enduring social force that has impacts on many dimensions of health and causes of death, and even when new medical treatments or procedures are developed. Third, sociologists in particular have been very effective in detailing the ways that educational attainment facilitates access to key health-related resources across the whole life course. It's not just when people are in school. We discuss such resources later in this webinar, but for now emphasize that such resources are multidimensional and range far beyond the labor market and income rewards associated with higher levels of educational attainment. Finally, educational attainment is policy amenable. Local, state, and national governments can act to alter, i.e. increase educational attainment if it is viewed as a key policy priority. Empirically, a very important recent paper in this area, headed by Jennifer Montez, conducted a systematic study of educational attainment and adult mortality using an enormous nationally representative data set of adults to best determine just how educational attainment is related to mortality rates in U.S. society. The key findings, as depicted in this graph, were the following. First, adults with more years of educational attainment up through 11 years have modestly lower mortality rates as educational attainment goes up. Second, there is a large step function at 12 years of education, i.e. high school graduation. Mortality rates drop significantly among U.S. adults with a high school degree. Third, beyond 12 years, there is a steeper slope reduction in mortality rates for U.S. adults. Adults with more years of education have lower and lower mortality rates. Fourth, there is no floor. The more education, the lower the mortality rate, all the way up through PhDs, MDs, and JDs. And fifth, this pattern was identical for both women and men. Perhaps most important, this recent study points to the fundamental importance of the high school degree in U.S. society. As I think of it, it's the idea of getting adolescents into the ballgame for adulthood. Keeping these general findings in mind, the next three slides depict some nuances in the relationship between educational attainment and adult mortality. First, this slide depicts that there are some interesting age-related patterns to consider in the education mortality relationship. This graph, which looks at U.S. women, shows the percentage by which mortality rates are higher among less educated women in comparison to women with 17 or more years of schooling in each age group. For example, in the middle of the graph among 45 to 64-year-olds, the mortality rate for U.S. women is 122% higher among those with 9 to 11 years of schooling compared to those with 17 or more years of schooling. There are three age-related points to consider in this graph. First, relatively high mortality among the less educated is especially pronounced in young adulthood and middle adulthood, although the less educated continue to have higher mortality rates even in the older adult years. Also keep in mind that the elderly have the highest mortality rates, so even small mortality differences in older adulthood are really important. But again, the relative differences are very high at ages 25 to 44 and 45 to 64. Second, the high school degree level is again seen as a very important step. Women in every age group with a high school degree have far lower mortality rates than women with less than a high school degree in each age group. Third, educational attainment above the high school degree is associated with lower and lower mortality rates in each age group. There are also some interesting race-ethnic patterns to consider in the education mortality relationship. This graph, looking at U.S. women of all adult ages together, shows the percentage by which mortality rates are higher among less educated groups, again in comparison to those with 17 or more years of schooling. Separately so for Hispanics, non-Hispanic blacks, and non-Hispanic whites. For example, in the middle part of the graph, among non-Hispanic black women, the mortality rate is 95% higher among those with 9 to 11 years of schooling compared to those with 17 or more years of schooling. A couple of key points are important here. First, the widest relative disparities are evident among non-Hispanic whites. That is, low-educated white women exhibit especially high mortality in comparison to highly educated white women. That said, the highest educated adults in each racial and ethnic group have the lowest adult mortality. That is, all groups seem to benefit in major ways from higher levels of education. Finally, there are important cause of death differences when examining the education-mortality relationship. An important study on this topic by Joe Phelan and colleagues looked at educational attainment and cause of death patterns, with particular attention given to causes that were rated as being highly preventable. Think of lung cancer, heart disease, and homicide, causes that can be prevented or treated, versus those rated as having low preventability. For example, think of cancers such as gallbladder cancer or a disease such as multiple sclerosis that are very difficult to prevent or treat. As might logically be expected, this graph shows that educational differences in mortality were substantial for causes that are highly preventable. Or in other words, higher levels of educational attainment are in some ways helping to reduce death rates from causes that are preventable. On the other hand, educational attainment differences in mortality due to causes that are rated as having low preventability are small. Education is not protecting against such difficult to prevent causes. Here, for example, consider U.S. women aged 45 to 64, who are depicted in this graph, with 9 to 11 years of schooling. They have a 93% higher mortality rate than women with 17 or more years of schooling for highly preventable causes of death. Thus, it appears as if educational attainment is helping to protect people from dying of causes that are preventable, which makes perfect sense if educational attainment is providing people with resources to enhance their lives and their health. So to recap thus far, I focused on 3 key patterns in the data. First, there are major differences in U.S. mortality rates by educational attainment. The high school degree in particular is a major threshold for lower mortality rates. Second, while there is some variation in this pattern by age group and race and ethnicity, the overall pattern is similar across subgroups of the population. And third, educational attainment is strongly associated with preventable causes of death, causes for which resources could seemingly be playing a very important role. But while our data and methods of analysis are getting better and better, scholars have documented these kinds of patterns for a number of years. A key question arises: are these patterns changing in the United States? In a nutshell, the answer is a big yes. So let's look at what's changing. Over the last 5 years, there have been 6 independent studies of changes in the educational mortality relationship in the United States that focus on data from the past 3 decades, basically since around 1980. These studies have used different data sets, they come from different scientific disciplines, and they have used different methodologies. Importantly, all have found widening educational differences in U.S. adult mortality for both women and men. Or in other words, there is now a larger mortality gap between adults with low education and those with high education than existed just 2 to 3 decades ago. We show results here for non-Hispanic white women aged 45 to 54 and 55 to 64 from one of those studies, conducted by Jennifer Montez, Mark Hayward, myself, Richard Rogers, and Hai-Young Wu. The 2 graphs show mortality rates for white women at 3 time points: around 1989, around 1996, and around 2003. The mortality rates are, of course, higher among women 55 to 64 on the right graph in comparison to women 45 to 54 on the left graph. There are 2 key points to take home from this illustration. First, the mortality rate gaps between the low-educated women and the highly educated women are wider in more recent years than they were just 15 to 20 years ago. And second, while rates for highly educated adults have continued to decline, there have even been some increases in rates among low-educated individuals, such as shown here for both these age groups of white women. The overtime trends for black women, black men, and white men are modestly different than for white women, but all groups in the study and the other 5 recent studies in this topic show that educational attainment has become a more and more important differentiator of U.S. adult mortality rates over the past 2 to 3 decades. So, you might ask, just how wide are educational differences in mortality at the present time? Let's take a look at the most recent life expectancy estimates for U.S. adults, prepared by Brian Rostron and colleagues at the National Center for Health Statistics. Using cleaned up data from 33 U.S. states in 2005, they showed that first at age, these are life expectancy figures at age 25. So at age 25, women with a college degree or graduate degree are expected to live on average an additional 62 years, or a total of 87 years, while women without a high school degree are only expected to live on average an additional 50 years, or a total of 75 years. This is a 12-year difference for women between those with less than a high school degree in comparison to those with college or more. For men, who are shaded in the darker colors on the graph, those with a college degree or graduate degree are expected to live on average an additional 57 to 60 years, or a total of 82 to 85 years, while men without a high school degree are only expected to live on average an additional 44 years, or a total of 69 years. This is a 13 to 16 year difference for men. In our extensive review of studies on this topic, these are the largest differences that have ever existed in the United States between those with low and high levels of education, and signify that there is much room for improvement among the less educated. Given these very large differences, again probably the widest in U.S. history, we now turn to a short discussion of the reasons for such wide differences. To think about why educational attainment is so strongly associated with mortality rates and adult life expectancy in contemporary U.S. society, we really need to think about both early life factors associated with educational attainment, as well as the ways by which educational attainment could influence health and ultimately longevity through what we call adult mechanisms. Increasingly, studies in this area are taking into account the early life factors that influence both educational attainment and potentially mortality and life expectancy. These include factors such as parental socioeconomic status, child health, and the like portrayed on the left side of the figure. Research-wise, this is not an easy thing to do, given the data needed for such modeling. While this is a controversial area and results to date vary to some degree across countries, the best U.S. studies to date have found that taking into account the kinds of early life factors mentioned here have only modest influences on the education mortality association. For example, Jennifer Montez and Mark Hayward recently combined survey measures of educational attainment with a broad set of child health and parental socioeconomic characteristics to predict mortality over a 10-year period for U.S. adults age 50 and over. Even after they accounted for these parental socioeconomic and childhood health characteristics, they found very wide educational differences in adult mortality rates for both U.S. men and women. In other words, taking into account those early life factors portrayed on the left side of the graph didn't make much difference in terms of the educational attainment differences in adult mortality. Other studies have focused on the challenging task of identifying adult mechanisms that link educational attainment with adult mortality, often grouping them into 4 categories, as we've done here in this diagram. The first is socioeconomic factors, including occupation, income, and wealth. Over time, of course, many studies in sociology and demography have shown that people with high levels of educational attainment have higher levels of income, accumulate more wealth, and have more satisfying occupations in comparison to people with less education. Those relationships have even become stronger over the last 30 or so years. Second, people with high levels of education are also more likely to have greater social and psychological resources that are health enhancing and increase longevity as well. For example, people with high levels of educational attainment are more and more likely to marry other people with high levels of educational attainment, be surrounded with neighbors with high levels of educational attainment, and work with colleagues with high levels of educational attainment. Why is that important? Consider, for example, the idea that in a workplace setting, people with high levels of educational attainment can ask one another, who's the best physician to go see for this kind of health issue? Did you hear about the latest information on the news regarding such and such health problem, etc.? These kinds of social and psychological resources enhanced by educational attainment can be important for both health and longevity. Third, health-related behavior has become an important link between educational attainment and longevity. Most so, patterns of smoking, diet, exercise, and even things like seatbelt use have increasingly become differentiated by educational attainment. In a highly technical, information-oriented society, such as the one in which we live, access to information, the skills to weigh the risks and rewards of acting on that information, and the resources to act on that information have become increasingly concentrated among those with high levels of education. Fourth, cognitive functioning is also thought to be an important mechanism that helps link educational attainment to health and longevity. A recent very important paper by David Baker and colleagues illustrated how cognitive functioning is enhanced through educational attainment and how cognitive functioning works to influence health and longevity throughout the life course. Consider, for example, that children today spend more and more time in school. They learn to read, write, analyze, and evaluate information in successively complex ways. And they learn to apply those skills throughout life to enhance their health and to increase their longevity. That is, cognitive functioning is thought to be one of the most important adult mechanisms linking higher levels of educational attainment to mortality and life expectancy. Two research groups have attempted to quantify the extent to which these mechanisms explain current educational differences in adult mortality. The figures shown here on this slide combine estimates from David Cutler and Adriana Laris-Muni and Richard Rogers and colleagues to provide kind of ballpark estimates of the extent to which these mechanisms account for educational differences in mortality. We urge caution. These are quite inexact estimates. They're very, very difficult to estimate. And moreover, the early childhood factors mentioned on the previous slide are also operating in this process. These sets of factors are also interrelated with one another as well. That said, these estimates suggest that socioeconomic attainment and health behaviors are each thought to account for about 1/3 of the relationship between higher levels of educational attainment and mortality rates in the United States. Enhanced social and psychological resources are thought to account for maybe 10 to 20% of the relationship between education and adult mortality. While cognitive functioning, recently proposed by David Baker and colleagues as being very important, is unknown. We simply don't know how much, to what extent that accounts for higher levels of longevity among those who are highly educated, but it's possibly very important. Clearly, the complete understanding of why educational attainment is so strongly related with mortality and life expectancy is far down the road. The scientific community has a long way to go here, and it's a very challenging task. But we've made some inroads as illustrated here. Next, we're going to discuss some policy implications that emerge from our understanding of the association between educational attainment and adult mortality. And I now turn the presentation over to my colleague, Elaine Hernandez.
Thank you, Bob. What we have discussed thus far reiterates a long history of research in demography. Educational attainment is fundamental to people's life chances and ultimately their longevity. Recently, a number of scholars, including Robert Cheney, James House, George Kaplan, and Harold Pollack, have begun to emphasize that social policies also affect health outcomes. Given that educational attainment plays such a key role, upstream social policy interventions also serve as health policies. To explain this idea, I'm going to share a parable described by medical sociologist Irving Zola. There I am, standing by the shore of a swiftly flowing river, and I hear the cry of a drowning man. So I jump into the river, put my arms around him, pull him to shore, and apply artificial respiration. Just when he begins to breathe, there is another cry for help. So I jump into the river, reach him, pull him to shore, and apply artificial respiration. And then just as he begins to breathe, another cry for help. So back in the river again, reaching, pulling, applying, breathing, and then another yell. Again and again, without end, goes the sequence. You know, I'm so busy jumping in, pulling them to shore, applying artificial respiration, that I have no time to see who is upstream, pushing them all in. Now, we can map this parable onto the conceptual framework that Bob just presented and think about what are the upstream factors that are pushing people into the river and how can we intervene in them to prevent people from falling into the river in the first place. As he mentioned, demographers and social scientists have found that early life factors are very important determinants of health and life expectancy. These early life factors are associated with educational attainment in a number of ways. And importantly, most often people complete their education by early adulthood. Thus, both these early life factors and educational attainment are set by early adulthood. Throughout adulthood, these factors determine other important markers of adult status, such as occupation, income, and wealth, as we've described. These markers of adult socioeconomic status combine with other mechanisms to directly influence health outcomes and life expectancy overall. Viewing this spectrum in its entirety and thinking about the river example, we can see how these factors operate together to influence how long, on average, people will expect to live at the population level. And we can envision this as a river of upstream and downstream factors leading to overall life expectancy. If we want to intervene upstream, really, again, to help prevent people from falling into the river, we need to think carefully about how to design policy interventions to improve educational attainment at the population level. So in terms of investing in education, given that there's a spectrum of factors that occur over the entire life course to influence health and life expectancy, any policy intervention designed to improve educational attainment should consider the entire education process. Each step of the process, including early childhood, elementary level, secondary level, and post-secondary schooling, is important in determining educational success. And investing in earlier education will help empower teenagers with the opportunity to complete high school, which, as we've seen, is very important for overall life expectancy. We've observed that there's a steep reduction in mortality rates when people have completed high school. But each additional year of education may provide an added benefit overall. As a very rough estimate of the payoff from increasing educational attainment, scholars have begun to estimate the value of an additional year of education even beyond high school. Moreover, these estimates only account for the total life expectancy. We also need to remember that education improves quality of life as well. So what do we need to know, or what do we know about educational attainment among U.S. adults today? What I show in this figure here is educational attainment among young U.S. adults between the ages of 25 to 34 over the past 2 decades, from 1992 to 2012. Where should we focus our policy efforts to enhance educational attainment at the population level? We've grouped these young adults into 3 categories here to show those who did not complete high school, those that completed high school, some college or an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, or a graduate degree, which includes those who have completed a master's degree, a JD or professional degree, or a PhD. We can see some slight changes in the overall pattern over the past couple of decades, but I really want to draw your attention to the percentage of the population that did not complete high school. First, the percent of young adults who did not complete high school has not varied significantly over the past couple of decades. By 2012, the most recent data available, approximately 11% of young adults did not complete a high school degree or a GED. When we look at this figure separately by gender, the rate is even higher for men at 12% than it is for women at 9%. Even more, when we consider these differences by race ethnicity, we see larger disparities. Approximately 12% of African Americans and 28% of Hispanics did not complete high school. These numbers, especially for minorities, provide a very large target for social policy interventions to improve population health. There is an important caveat to the data that I show in this figure. The data do not include the institutionalized population. For instance, people who are in prisons or in hospitals. Including these institutionalized people would drive up the percent in the category less than high school. Thus, what we're showing here in the estimates that we've provided are a conservative estimate. So how might we design policies to intervene? There are at least 2 approaches that policymakers can consider when designing a new social policy as health policy. In other words, when they're trying to intervene upstream to prevent people from falling into the river. We can target education policies and mortality, or we could aim to improve overall population health. So for the first example here, I show a figure to explain how we would target the differentials, or the educational disparities in mortality. We know that, on average, people who have a higher level of education have a longer life expectancy than people with a lower level of education, for the reasons that we've described. So I've grouped these into 2 categories, just for ease of presenting this information. Those in the high education group and those in the low education group. If we want to target the disparity between the 2, policymakers should aim to improve the education levels among people with the low educational attainment, or the people in the low education group. Under ideal circumstances, following a social policy intervention to improve education levels, we would see an increase in educational attainment among this low educated group, the people with less education. And in turn, following this increase in educational attainment, the low education group would, again, under ideal circumstances, have an increase in life expectancy at time 2. Essentially, we're specifically targeting that educational disparity in life expectancy. And based on our best information, we could anticipate a reduction in that disparity if these people increase their education level. As you can imagine, this type of intervention most benefits those who have the highest mortality rates as adults. In the United States, for instance, this would include African American men who die on average much earlier than women or non-minority men. Moving on to the second example, we could look at improving overall population health. Again, here's a figure to explain how we would go about this intervention. As I mentioned previously, on average, people who have a higher level of education have a longer life expectancy, so we have the same setup for the time 1. But in this instance, we would aim to improve education levels for everyone, thus improving population health overall. So once again, under ideal circumstances, following a social policy intervention to improve overall population health, we would see an increase in educational attainment for everyone. following this increase in educational attainment, both people in the high and the low education group would have an increase in life expectancy at time 2. Again, this is based on our best information that we have available to date. Thus, in this example, we're specifically aiming to improve education levels and life expectancy among the entire population. However, this approach results in much smaller improvements overall. So neither approach is ideal, and there are some important challenges to enhancing education policy. From the first example, disparity policies do not address the entire population. We're specifically targeting people with the lowest level of education. Again, in the example that I provided, this could be minority men. In the second example, population improvement policies do address the entire population, but they do not address the disparity. We're simply looking to improve educational attainment overall, and thus increase life expectancy overall. Another downside is that any intervention to improve educational attainment may take years or decades to occur between that investment and the mortality benefit or the increase in life expectancy. And finally, what I'm saying here is really a simplification of what we could anticipate. The actual real world, it's far more difficult to predict how these investments will affect mortality long term. And so what I've stated is really under ideal circumstances. Moreover, we need to remember that any policy intervention to enhance education will take place during a time when the education process is really changing. We all know that an increasing number of students are taking classes online or away from the classroom. Thus, any intervention needed to work within the dynamic, any investments need to work within the dynamic education system and attempt to use these new modes of education to their advantage. We want to also emphasize that it's very important to enhance our investments in the education process. While it's very important to enhance our investments in the education process during childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood, there are alternatives for adults to improve their educational attainment. In terms of the examples we've already provided, we can think of these people as already fallen into the river. In this instance, a recent paper by Katrina Walsman and my co-author show that the investments in later life education are also associated with better health. So it's important to remember that even if people are past young adulthood, we can still improve their education, and that is associated with improvements in health. Additionally, we do not want to detract from the important policy investments that occur downriver, such as public health programs to help with smoking cessation. Despite all the uncertainties, enhancing educational attainment and especially reducing or eliminating non-completion of high school in the United States is clearly the most logical policy given the research that we've presented thus far and the most relevant or the most up-to-date research that we have. So finally, I would just like to conclude with our key points from the presentation today. Regardless of how we choose to design social policies to improve population health, we know that educational attainment is strongly tied to quality and length of life in the United States. We have very clear evidence from demographers, economists, sociologists, and public health researchers that people who are more highly educated live longer and healthier lives. Yet, at the population level, we continue to observe significant educational disparities. On average, 11% of young adults have not completed high school, a figure that is significantly higher for minorities. Given these disparities, we urge policymakers to focus on enhanced educational investments in order to substantially increase high school completion. Research has shown, again, as we mentioned, that substantial increase in life expectancy for people has shown a substantial increase in life expectancy for people who have completed at least a high school degree. And finally, we need to invest in future interdisciplinary research in order to address the increasingly complex educational process in the United States. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Bob and Elaine. We're now going to take a few questions that have come in. I'll start with, we have someone who asked if the widening gap that you've seen in mortality by different education levels, could that be attributed in part to the increasingly negative selection of those with less than a high school education?
So Mark, I guess I can weigh in on that one. That's a great question. That's the idea that increasingly people who do not complete high school have characteristics that are also more and more likely to cause them to have high rates of mortality and low levels of life expectancy. So sure, that could be the case. You think, for example, over the course of the 20th century when fortunately we kind of shifted more and more people out of the low levels of education into the groups with high levels of education. So kind of if you think about that massive social change, who are the people who are now in those lower levels of education? And it could be those who are more likely to have, very likely to have disadvantaged childhood environments, have poor childhood health, and so forth. So, well, I greatly respect the idea that selection into low levels of education could be responsible for this changing relationship between educational attainment and adult mortality. I don't think that's the answer why these disparities are increasing. Think for a minute about the graph that Elaine showed about changes in educational attainment in the U.S. over the last 20 years. At ages 25 to 34, there's been very slow declines in that less than high school degree. Now, we're still stuck at around 11%, and 20 years ago it was around 14%. And we've also got to take into account that during that period of time, as Elaine mentioned, we've imprisoned a lot more people over that time period. So that decline from 14 to 11% is probably not even that much. So I don't think selectivity is changing that much at the low end. And instead, I think the type of society we're living in, a highly technical, rapidly changing society, information-based society, has got to be the key reason why these disparities are increasing.
Okay. There's a couple questions that have come in that I think I can group together about the broader socioeconomic status of people. You don't mention socioeconomic status as a broader category, but is that because we're just assuming that mortality goes hand in hand with education and that's the key factor? And then someone else asks, are there still mortality differences by education evident when adult income levels are held constant?
You kind of, or I can weigh in on this, or
I think that we chose to think about this as a spectrum of factors influencing, and so we believe that education and other measures of socioeconomic status are very important, but they matter at different points over the life course. And so we are focusing on education because it is so fundamentally associated with mortality, but it also occurs when people are younger, and it's usually completed in young adulthood, whereas other measures of socioeconomic status tend to be set a little bit later in life. And so if we think about this over the course of someone's life, if we want to intervene more upstream, that education is very important. But we do want to emphasize that other measures of socioeconomic status are very important for some of these intervening mechanisms, such as employment, access to income, and other measures of socioeconomic status like occupational prestige. Do you want to add anything, Bob?
Sure. Regarding the second point there, which is also a great question, that clearly, yes, there are educational differences in mortality and life expectancy after income is taken into account. There's a number of studies that show that. So if you start with kind of the basic educational difference in mortality and say we control for income, roughly, most studies will show that roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of the educational difference remains. So as Elaine mentioned, people who obtain high levels of education are more likely to earn more money and do better in the labor market and so forth. We know that, and that's become increasingly true over the last 30 or so years. But this isn't just a story about people with high levels of education earning more money and doing better in the labor market. That's part of it. It's maybe, you know, a third of it. But the other kinds of resources that high levels of education facilitate are also very important parts of the story. And those, you know, as we discussed, things like social and psychological resources. You know, who is it that that people with high levels of education have access to, are talking to, are benefiting from, and so forth. And it's you know, how highly educated people in comparison to those with lower levels of education are behaving in terms of health. You know, exercise, nutrition, smoking, wearing seatbelts, and so forth. Those are equally important parts of the story. So this is not just a story about income, although it is, income is an important portion of it.
I will just jump in and really reiterate what Bob was saying in there in terms of why education is important and how it is related to these other measures of socioeconomic status, such as income or occupational prestige. First, it can be a resource. It can lead you to have better chance in the labor market and better access to income or health insurance or something more downstream, for instance. But education is also very important because it provides people with knowledge and self-efficacy. It enables them to acquire, to decipher, and act upon new health information when they're diagnosed with a new disease, for instance. And these are all things that are not, that aspect of education is less related to these other measures of socioeconomic status, but yet it's very important as people age, as they are diagnosed with a new health event, or as they are encountering health information over the course of their life.
Okay, great. Can you say a few words about racial ethnic differences in college completion for young adults today? And given that we have a very rapid growth in minority populations, what are the implications of those racial ethnic differences in terms of your study? And then one other follow-up question, I guess a comment from someone, is that 45% of those with less than a high school education are either first or second generation immigrants. So what are the implications there?
Well,
Elaine, do you want to do the first part and I'll
sure.
Okay.
Sure. So just to kind of reiterate what I had said earlier, and then I can answer more specifically if there are any follow-up questions, but approximately 11% of people overall haven't completed high school, which we know is an important marker, and approximately 12% of African Americans, and that figure is as high as 28% for Hispanics. So that's significantly higher for these minority groups. And this is, again, if we kind of think back to that conceptual diagram and that framework, this is setting people, African Americans, for instance, or these Hispanics, on a completely different life course than people who, than their white counterparts, for instance. And so they are disadvantaged in young adulthood and then disadvantaged in all of those through all of those mechanisms that are leading to life expectancy rates overall. So Hispanics, for instance, are going to have worse outcomes in the labor market, lower income, and other problems over their life course, which is really going to set them on a disadvantaged path overall. And so it's an excellent point, and it's very important to pay attention to these subgroup differences by race, ethnicity, and also by gender.
Yeah, and the participant who asked the question about a substantial fraction of young adults, people with less than high school, are first or second generation is an excellent point. So, in some cases, of course, people who are 25 to 34 who are in that data may migrate to the United States, say, when they're 25, and they maybe have 10 years of schooling, and yes, they do show up in the data as less than high school, and that in our kind of social policy regime, we haven't had a chance to influence their educational attainment unless that's done in so-called kind of later life. That said, there are many, well, the figure of 45% of less than high school are first or second generation. A large fraction of those people, we have a chance to intervene in very positive ways to help them in complete high school. Everyone in the second generation falls into that category, of course. So that would be an ideal group, as a matter of fact, for the kind of policy interventions that we're recommending to work. In my home state of Texas, for example, demographer Steve Murdoch has for years and years discussed the very important group of second generation folks, i.e. those people who are children of immigrants, and their educational attainment as being fundamentally important for the state of Texas, for health, for the labor market, for how much we spend on social programs, for imprisonment, and so forth. So, in some ways, while we both realize that there is a small subset of people with less than high school education that maybe the social policy influences that we're recommending might not be able to reach, a large fraction of either first generation, i.e. immigrants themselves who come to the U.S. as kids, or the second generation, this, again, largely Hispanic or Asian immigrants, or immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean, this is where I think we can make a huge difference in not only increasing the high school completion rate, but also in enhancing the nation's health, and as a kind of a side note, potentially reducing racial and ethnic disparities in health as well. I see this as a major opportunity rather than something that we shouldn't worry about, or we think is not something we can do anything about.
I will just add in there too that what we have presented today is a simplification of these complex processes, particularly for people who are first or second generation, but getting into the educational system can help level the playing field and enable them with the opportunities to enter the labor force, or to really acquire some of those resources that I mentioned earlier, or the health literacy to make decisions over the course of their life. So it's really, again, as Bob mentioned, very complex process, but it's an opportunity to intervene in a more upstream point in the life course.
Okay. There's a question about whether or not adult learning, so people who might they've only gotten a high school education, and then later in life they decide to go back to school, would that have a similar positive effect?
Yeah. So Mark, that's also a fantastic question, and one I've dabbled with a little bit in the literature that Elaine mentioned, I'll further describe here, but that I think is going to become increasingly important question as more and more people in the United States and elsewhere go on to schooling at different ages and in different forms and so forth. So let me describe one effort to look at that question. Katrina Walsman and colleagues, including myself, took a look at people in the United States, a random sample of adults in the United States aged 25 to 40 who obtained additional degrees during that time between ages 25 and 40, in some ways later than what the kind of traditional schedule of schooling usually implies. So this paper is published in the American Journal of Public Health a year or so ago, and looked at the health outcomes of people who did and those who did not obtain these kind of additional degrees in, say, early adulthood. And the results were in the way that you mentioned, Mark, that they were people who obtained these additional degrees did tend to have better health, as self-reported health, and lower levels of depression at age 40 in comparison to people who did not obtain additional degrees between ages 25 and 40. So, it's a limited age range. We didn't look at mortality because in that data set it was a survey sample and not many people had died by age 40, fortunately. And our health outcomes were self-reported. But that paper, and there's been a few others like it in recent literature, provides some evidence that so-called later life learning or additional years of schooling beyond, say, age 25 can have health-related benefits. Okay, that said, this is, a very complex process. There's all kinds of different types of additional schooling that people undertake, and there's much that we don't know. But to date, I would say that the weight of the evidence does favor that schooling, no matter when it happens, is associated with better health and probably lower mortality.
Okay. Based on the time, I think we probably just have time for one more question here. So someone mentions this is great research, and thanks you for bringing this to light, but having said that, how do you plan on getting this information into the hands of educational administrators, policymakers, and others to act on these recommendations?
That's a very excellent point, and thank you for whoever asked that question. And I would actually turn that over to the people in the audience and ask you to help us get this information in the proper hands as well. But we are working very closely with getting this information out with a press release, and then trying to spread the word as much as possible, and we'd be more than grateful if you helped us.
Yes, and the other part of that too is we both teach courses. The word gets out in that way. The effort we're undertaking right now is something that's, I think, new to Elaine and definitely new to me as well. It's been wonderful to write a population bulletin, thinking about a wider audience who might read and act upon this information. And it's also important that as scholars we do more and more of this kind of activity, publicizing the results from such studies, visiting our congressional representatives, talking to the press about these ideas and so forth. And I think as an academy in general, over the course of my career, I've seen scholars doing more and more of this type of thing. But we clearly need to reach out in ways like this and not just talk to each other in kind of scientific journals.
Great. Well, I want to thank Bob and Elaine for an excellent presentation. For those who joined late, I do want to remind people we have the full report that they wrote for the Population Reference Bureau is available on PRB's website, our homepage at www.prb.org. We have also recorded this webinar, so people will be able to go back and listen to this later. You should receive an email to that effect within the next 24 hours. And then I just want to remind people it is helpful if you could fill out the survey as you exit the webinar. A little survey will pop up, and that will help us plan future webinars. So thank you everyone for attending, and that concludes today's webinar.
Thank you, Mark, and everyone for attending.
Thank you.